An elderly woman rests at the entrance of a pitch-black cave. She has fewer than 2 days left on this earth, and she is telling her son precisely what took place inside the Garden of Eden. Accounts that stand in direct opposition to everything the Western world has ever been taught. The gleaming gold beneath the river currents, the radiant, living luminance, the scent of a tree that has no business existing in any world we know. This testimony was locked inside a forbidden Ethiopian manuscript called The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan for more than 1,000 years, and monks dwelling in the remote mountain ranges of Ethiopia are only now permitting a complete translation to reach the wider world. What she recalled about Eden. The first thing she communicated to Seth was about the light. Not daylight, not anything we would recognize. She said the illumination inside the garden did not originate from one point. It came from all directions simultaneously. The atmosphere itself radiated brightness. The soil reflected it back upward. The leaves absorbed it and held it like memory. Dr. August Dillmann, the German scholar at the University of Gießen who first rendered this document from the original Ge'ez language in 1853, observed in his annotations that the portrayal of Eden's luminance in this scroll bears no resemblance to any other ancient writing in existence. He called it one of the most extraordinary passages he had ever studied in all of Ethiopic literature. And that was only the beginning of what she disclosed. She described the gold that lined the riverbed of the Pishon, one of the 4 rivers of paradise. Not gold as we think of it, hammered into coins or shaped into jewelry. Gold that moved beneath the surface of the water, like a living current threading through the body of the earth. She told Seth the water in that river was so transparent you could trace every single particle of gold shimmering at the bottom, even where the current ran deep and fast. She spoke about the creatures of the garden, how they moved without anxiety, how they approached her and Adam freely and without hesitation, how the serpent, before its fall, had been the most magnificent of all living things. And then she turned to the tree of life. Here is where it shifts. She did not describe it the way any of us would anticipate. She said the fragrance emanating from the tree of life was like breathing the exhale of the Creator himself. Not a scent you registered in your nostrils, a presence that entered your chest and altered the condition of your entire being. It saturated you with a stillness so profound that the very idea of fear ceased to exist while you stood anywhere near it. And she could still detect it. After centuries in exile, after hundreds of years sleeping on cold stone and consuming whatever the cursed ground reluctantly gave up, that fragrance was still embedded somewhere deep in her, as vivid and precise as the morning she was driven out. She urged Seth not to look at the thorns splitting through the ground and assume that was the original blueprint. The thorns were not the design. They were the penalty. The earth, as it was first made, was something entirely different. Something his generation had never laid eyes on and lacked the framework to even picture. She was gripped by a terror that if she passed from this world without transferring this memory, her grandchildren would settle into a fractured world as though it were the only one that ever existed. They would mistake the thorns for the garden. They would receive exile as though it were home. And that was something she absolutely could not permit. This is where it begins to press uncomfortably against anyone who wants to dismiss her as a minor character. She was the memory keeper for the entire human species. While Adam occupied himself with labor and structure and daily survival, she was the one who kept the blueprint of paradise burning. She carried it like a torch in a world rapidly going dark, and she spent her final hours ensuring that torch was passed into Seth's hands before it guttered out completely. The Ethiopian monks revere her for precisely this reason. They do not refer to her as the woman who failed. They call her the first teacher of the hidden things, the one who remembered the path back, the widow of the world. Allow me to step back and lay out the timeline, because the structure itself conceals a secret most people entirely miss. According to the scrolls, Adam died on a Friday, the very same day of the week on which he had originally been formed. There is a deliberate symmetry embedded in that detail by the ancient writers who put this down. But she did not follow him. She outlasted him by precisely 6 days. And those 6 days were not arbitrary. They were a mirror of the 6 days of creation. Just as the Creator had spent 6 days fashioning the rivers, the creatures, the mountains, and the stars, she spent 6 days releasing her connection to the earth, one thread at a time, one memory at a time. Day by day, she was untethering herself from a world she had inhabited for nearly 1,000 years. For almost an entire week, she was the sole living person on the planet who remembered what it felt like to walk through the garden. She was the last witness, the widow of the entire world. Every single person breathing owed their existence to her, and not one of them could carry even a fraction of what she held inside. The scrolls describe her sitting at the opening of the Cave of Treasures, the dark hollow carved into the mountainside where Adam had just been laid, and she refused food and water entirely. Her body was weakening, but her mind was sharper than it had been in years. Her gaze stayed fixed on the skyline, searching for some trace of the radiance she had lost, scanning for the glow of Eden somewhere beyond the mountains. Solomon Caesar Milan, the Oxford-trained linguist who produced the first English translation of this text in 1882, wrote in his personal notes that this passage struck him as one of the most emotionally shattering sequences in all of ancient pseudepigraphal literature. He said the image of the first woman sitting alone at the entrance of a cave, choosing to refuse nourishment, the sole human alive who retained the memory of paradise, stayed with him long after he had set the translation down. She was not simply grieving. According to the text, she was functioning as a bridge between two planes of existence. The material world behind her, her children, her grandchildren, the entire human family, and the unseen world ahead, the place Adam had just entered. She was the only human being capable of perceiving both sides simultaneously. Her descendants encircled her, but they could not see what she was seeing. They could not hear what she was hearing. And that gap between her experience and theirs is what makes her next disclosure so staggering. The chariot descending from the sky. On the 4th day following Adam's burial, she stopped speaking. Mid-sentence, silence. Her eyes remained open, but nothing in the room registered in them. Seth called her name. Her children shook her gently. No response. She had entered a condition the scrolls describe as something beyond sleep and something beyond consciousness. Her body present in the cave, her awareness departed to somewhere entirely else. And then it happened. The sky split open directly above the cave. Not a gradual parting, not a slow widening. The text describes it as a tearing, sudden and violent, the way fabric gives way when a force far greater than it can withstand takes hold. And beyond that tear, she did not encounter emptiness. She did not see a void waiting to consume her. She saw an enormous chariot of blinding radiance descending from above, drawn by 4 immense eagles, whose wings were so vast and so luminous they blotted out the heavens for miles in every direction. The light pouring off those wings was not fire, it was not sunlight. It was the same illumination she remembered from the garden. That warm, breathing, pulsing glow that seemed to carry intention within it. And riding on that chariot, surrounded by ordered ranks of celestial beings in perfect formation, she saw the soul of Adam. He was being escorted upward by the archangels Michael and Gabriel. Understand what she was witnessing. She was observing the very first human soul in all of history being carried into the afterlife. No living person before her had ever seen anything remotely like it. And what she saw next shattered the centuries of guilt she had been quietly hauling through every single day of her exile. She witnessed a place the text identifies as the Lake of Akarusan. In this vision, the angels immersed Adam's soul in crystalline water until his garments of light, the same ones stripped from him the moment they were expelled from Eden, were fully and completely restored. His brightness came back. His original radiance returned. He was whole. Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum, who devoted decades to translating Syriac and Ethiopic manuscripts, including the related Cave of Treasures texts, observed that the motif of heavenly cleansing and the restoration of luminous garments appears across numerous ancient Near Eastern traditions, but nowhere with the emotional magnitude found in the Ethiopian version. He described the passage as carrying a weight of restoration that seemed to exceed its own textual boundaries. That vision dismantled something inside her: the shame, the guilt, the belief that she had permanently broken everything. She watched Adam being made whole, and she understood in that instant that death was not a sentence. It was a homecoming. The exile was not final. That comprehension transformed everything about her remaining hours. She was no longer a condemned woman marking time. She was a queen preparing to return. And what she did next would alter the course of everything. Because the visions did not conclude with the chariot, they intensified into something far more vast: the final prophecy. At the break of the 5th day, a weight settled over the land, the kind of quiet that only arrives before something enormous is about to move. She understood that her remaining time was no longer measured in days. It was measured in hours. And in those final hours, she did something that would establish the template for every great assembly, every council of elders, every royal gathering across the entire arc of human civilization. She summoned a gathering. Every living descendant, every branch of the family she had brought into the world. They came down from mountaintops and up from valley floors, walking miles across rough and uneven terrain for one last sight of the first mother. Thousands of souls, the whole of humanity at that point in history, standing before her in a silence so heavy it seemed to compress the air itself. And when she rose to speak, she did not appear broken. She appeared like a monument carved from the mountain itself. She had no gold to distribute, no territory to deed to her heirs. The earth was still wild and lawless. Instead, she gave them something far more durable: words. A prophecy that would ripple through the darkened corridors of the future for thousands of years. She told them a day was coming when the entire surface of the earth would be swept clean by water. A great flood that would purge the corruption already spreading through the early generations. But her vision did not end there. She told them a second reckoning would arrive, far further down the line than any of them could conceive. Not water this time. Fire. The world would face its trial by flame. That was a terrifying revelation to a people who had only recently learned to coax fire into usefulness. They understood fire as a source of warmth and a means of preparing food. She was informing them it would one day devour the entire planet. But here is what anchored every heart in that gathering. She coupled the warning with a promise. She swore that the human seed carried inside her own body would survive both the drowning and the burning. Her bloodline would endure through every catastrophe the world could generate. No flood would erase it, no fire would consume it. And she spoke of a singular descendant, born of her own flesh, who would accomplish what no other human being in the entire history of the world could ever achieve. He would walk back through the sealed gates of the garden, and he would bring all of humanity with him. Every last soul. Consider that. This was the first recorded promise of a savior ever delivered to a suffering world. It did not come from a king enthroned in a palace. It did not come from a priest standing before an altar. It came from a dying woman at the edge of a cave, extending a thread of hope to a people weeping at the feet of their origin. She was describing events thousands of years before they would unfold. Standing at the very threshold of death, seeing to the end of time itself, while her lungs were still pulling in the cool, thin air of the ancient world. The most significant part, the part that was deliberately erased from the official record, is that she delivered this prophecy with the certainty of someone who was not speculating. She was reporting what had been shown to her, the marriage of the grave. The crossing from the 5th day into the 6th was the moment the physical world itself began to respond. When she finally drew her last breath on the 6th day, the earth beneath her did not simply go still, it began to vibrate. Not the violent rupturing of a quake, a deep, steady pulse like a heartbeat. The scrolls say the earth was expressing recognition, welcoming back the flesh and bone that had been shaped from its own dust at the very opening of the story. Her sons handled her body with a reverence that established the first burial rites in human history. They wrapped her in fine white cloth that caught the dim light filtering into the cave. They applied fragrant spices gathered from the sacred woods, scents intended to preserve the dignity of the first queen. Every gesture was deliberate. Every movement bore the weight of a ceremony no one had ever performed before, and one destined to be carried out by every generation that followed. They brought her into the Cave of Treasures, that dark, sacred vault hollowed into the mountainside, where the relics and offerings of the first family had been stored across generations. The gold, the incense, the myrrh that God had given Adam as tokens pointing toward a future promise. All of it resting inside that cave, untouched and waiting. And when the moment came to place her body to rest, they did not set her apart in a separate corner or a distant alcove. They laid her directly to the right of Adam, who had preceded her into the soil 6 days earlier. The ancient writings call this the marriage of the grave. It was the final reconciliation. Two people who had once been fashioned from a single body, separated at the dawn of creation, cast out from paradise together, enduring nearly 1,000 years of exile together, now reunited one last time in the silent embrace of the earth. Side by side in the dark, exactly as they had been before the world began. The first love story in all of human history, concluding in a cave carved into the side of a mountain. And then, believe it or not, it becomes stranger still. The moment they laid her beside Adam, something occurred that no one present could explain. The gold and the spices that had been sitting dormant inside that cave for generations suddenly began releasing a fragrance so overwhelming, so impossibly beautiful, that it could be detected for miles outside the mountain. People standing far from the entrance reported breathing in something for which they had no words at all, a scent that belonged to no plant, no flower, no living thing they had ever encountered. It was as though the aroma of the lost garden had been sealed inside those offerings from the very beginning, compressed and dormant, holding its breath, waiting for precisely this moment. And it was finally released into the open world because the two halves of humanity had been brought back together at last. That supernatural fragrance lingered for ages, a tangible, physical confirmation that the promise of the Creator was still breathing, still active, even within the stillness of a tomb. Why this story was kept from you. So why does nearly no one alive today know any of this? The answer is direct and deeply uncomfortable. The individuals who assembled the texts the Western world accepted as authoritative had a specific goal in mind. They were unsettled by the image of the first woman as a powerful prophet, a visionary leader, and the memory keeper of the human race. They needed a cautionary figure, a symbol of weakness, the origin point of human failure, and nothing beyond that. So they stripped away her death, her visions, her prophecies, her final words of enduring hope, and they reduced her to a character who existed in the record solely to make a mistake. But the monks in the high mountain sanctuaries of Ethiopia refused to comply. They understood that the history of the human family is irreparably incomplete without the testimony of the mother. They protected these scrolls with their lives because they held to a belief that the hope of the world was first spoken through her voice. For 6 days, she had been the widow of the world, a solitary figure of mourning who modeled for every future generation how to survive the longest, most brutal stretches of history without surrendering hope. She died with her eyes fixed on the sky, dreaming of the garden she had once walked through, and of the descendant who would one day lead her children back through its gates. She did not die as a failure. She died as the first prophet, the first teacher, the guardian of a memory so foundational that an entire religious establishment spent centuries engineering its erasure. If a story this central to the human origin could be buried for over 1,000 years, what else is concealed in those mountain caves? What other truths remain sealed inside clay jars or hidden behind the stone walls of forgotten sanctuaries scattered across the Ethiopian highlands? The full account of the beginning has not yet been told, and the Ethiopian Bible may be the only key that can open all of it. Would you want to live for 900 years if it meant carrying everything she carried? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are going deeper into the forbidden books of Ethiopia next. And what those scrolls reveal about what happened after the flood is going to rearrange everything you thought you understood.